Right, so I've muted myself.
And we're live.
Yep. So when are we starting? Is it
Off you go, John. Lead us.
okay? So wonderful. Thank you very much, and very nice to have you all at the table here today with this online virtual event. I hope you're all well during these crazy times with the lockdown. But I think there is light at the end of the tunnel with the media saying that there are coming vaccines coming out. So that's the good news. So my name is John Jensen, and I'm joined today with Dr. Max Blumberg and Dave Milner, and I'll let them introduce themselves a little bit later. But a short introduction to myself. So I am head of HR solution at Splash HR in EMEA. I've got a history of almost 20 years with cloud solutions, and the last 7 years with HR solutions, where those have also been occupied with people analytics for the last 3 years. Now, for the purpose of moving forward, I wanted to just show you a little bit about the agenda. This is all about the time to collaborate with finance. And the topic came out with Max, Dave, and I when we had having conversations about, the pandemic and how this has introduced new challenges to the organizations out there like yours in various ways. We know that HR and finance have had their own challenges. In finance, it's about costs and maintaining financial sustainability. And for HR, it's about how to handle people and the new way of working. So we actually agreed that maybe it would be good to share some of the knowledge that we have in these areas. So that is the purpose of today. We will focus on these 4 areas here, which is, Max and Dave will take us through why HR and finance should hook up first of all. And then also the context for change, and then they will discuss the value profile. The second part is, how do we change behavior in HR and finance to be collaborating more closely together? And then we'll look at the opportunities that are presented to us, but also go through a case study with the value profile as a methodology to get insight into some of the challenges organizations have and how they can achieve value out of these challenges. Then I'll come back and then do a little bit of a case study of how Splash HR has worked with the value profiler and also delivered value. And then we will open up for questions and hopefully answers from the team here today. And that's the plan for today. Really looking forward to it. I'll also ask you to ask any questions throughout the whole scenario here when we go into it, but we'll answer them as we get to them. So that's the scene set. Now I will go over for Max and Dave to introduce themselves. There you go, Max. Dave.
Hi, I'm Dave Milner. I'm probably better known in social media terms as HR curator. I'm in my 3rd career, from a corporate banker to an HR person and now a consulting psychologist. Passionate about the HR community, what HR can do, and recently wrote a book called Introduction to People Analytics.
And thanks, Dave. And I'm Max Blumberg, delighted to be here. And thank you very much to everybody for joining. And yes, I have a background in computer science and psychology. I'm not sure how they got together. And then more recently, I'm quite involved in AI. And I love people analytics. I love the idea of leveraging the maximum power from people, both empowering people and making organizations effective. And so really looking forward to sharing and hopefully towards the end hearing some of your ideas as well.
Okay.
Okay, so let me kickstart with a little bit about context for change. I think that there is a huge collaborative opportunity here. I spent many months with my fellow author Nadeem Khan when we were doing this people analytics book, really trying to understand what were the challenges, what were the context. And what came out is that the strengths of HR revolved around probably 5 key things. Very client responsive, very process efficient, cost focused, a trusted advisor, and obviously with significant talent expertise. Now, that may not necessarily be what HR needs to do, or should I say it's a good foundation for the future. But when we then started looking at what finance's strengths are, and we drew on some work that Boston Consulting had done with the best-in-class CFOs, we sort of found that process governance, data expertise, efficiency agenda, business impact, because everybody looks to finance because they have those numbers, and strategic alignment is really important. And that made us think that this collaborative opportunity is without doubt a really critical thing. And I think the pandemic has merely flagged that, because when we start to draw the 2 functions together and we look at way that we can make tangible and intangible measurement, we've got access to data expertise, which sometimes HR doesn't have. We can align talent and commercial challenges, which is always one of the key areas that are being asked of HR to do. It struck us that this is a real value add focus. We've got finance with the data, we've got HR with the stories. And what we were sort of thinking was, well, this seems to us as a partnering opportunity that can really drive performance. We've looked at the finance areas and obviously there's been a lot of access to, it's about value, it's about stewardship, it's about making sure that the data that's produced is of the greatest quality. And that's absolutely right. But I think the new normal, if we look into 2021, I call it the year of the dollar, and I make no bones about using the American dollar phrase, but I believe that all support functions next year are going to be really under the microscope, not just in terms of cost, but in terms of what value can you demonstrate to your executive leaders. Finance, as I said, have got the business and commercial data, we've got the stories. And sometimes our stories are not being able to be translated into something that creates that financial impact that wows the executives. There are lots of predictive future-based stories that will become more important. Max, as I mentioned earlier, is very much into the automation, the AI machine learning applications. That's going to give access to more data. And that means that we need to ensure that we identify what's the relevant data, that's quality data, and then start to make sure that we're able to draw together both these commercial challenges, but also the people challenges. We know that high performers focus on greater collaboration. That's proven from a lot of significant leadership studies. That means that better decision making is made, there's wider use of data and analytics, and there's a clearer partner-based measurement focus. Data drives accountability, and that's one of the critical things that we've got to do. And as I said, from our research that we did when we were assessing thousands of HR practitioners, we found that HR's behavioral strength is collaboration. So I think what we're saying is that why hasn't this become a vital performance partnership that is taken forward in a more significant way? Over to Max.
Thank you very much, Dave. Okay, so what I want to have a look at now is to talk about where one might start thinking about you could join HR and finance in an organization. And I'm going to do that through something called a value profiler, which I think you're going to like. And it all starts with the premise that when we spend money on people in organizations, on workforces, or on human capital, if you want to sound really, grown up about it, you're typically spending it on recruitment, learning and development, workforce planning, compensation, salaries, succession planning, etc. The key here is that you spend your money on people in organizations via processes. And once you see that, it becomes really clear how you can start looking at the value that you're getting from the money that you're putting into your people, the ROI. And that's what the value profiler is all about. So you might say, well, why do we have people processes in an organization? And here's an example. If you look towards the bottom, you see things like...
Max, are you showing some slides? I'm not sure if I can see
I am. Are they not? Let me have a look there. So I do apologize. I think might have got caught out. Oh, can you see it now?
Yes.
Sorry about that. Okay, so here you will see a number of familiar processes. Here's your recruitment, the learning and development, the reward and recognition, analytics. All of these are processes in an organization. You could say that organizational development and design is a process to the extent that you do it formally. And in fact, what research shows quite clearly is that when you don't look at things like organizational development as a process, when you do it ad hoc, generally you don't get effective results. So these are a typical collection of processes. But why do we have those processes in the first place in an organization? And the answer is that those processes purely exist to give us a set of workforce capabilities. That's where we get our employee experience, the workforce performance from the annual reviews or the weekly reviews or whatever one is doing now, from talent management, agility, etc. So processes exist to give rise to capabilities, and you can measure the processes and you can measure the capabilities to see which process do you need to give you which capability. But why do we have capabilities? Well, we have capabilities purely to give us the key performance drivers that we need in our organization, and that is productivity, the quality, which is the extent to which our services and products meet the needs of our clients or customers, innovation, and customer growth, which is depth and share of wallet. And why do we have those? Well, we have the key performance drivers because that is what gives us our financials that we see on the balance sheet and the income statement every year, the revenue growth, the return on investment on capital, the total return to the shareholders, the future value, etc. So it becomes really clear that if you start from the beginning here, if I just read through it again, the reason that we have people processes or that we invest in people processes is to give us the workforce capabilities we need to enable the key performance drivers to give us the business outcomes that our organization is looking for. Actually, if you're looking at this from a consultancy point of view or an internal people analytics, all of this only works if you are measuring these at every level and then looking for the statistical links, the correlation, if you like, between the processes, the capabilities, the performance, and the outcomes. If you're not getting correlations, well, then you've got to make a change to your processes, and we'll look at that in a second. So if you're starting, the way to start any project with people is you generally start from the right-hand side. And so you say, where is the business problem that we're having? So is it a revenue problem, a profitability problem, etc.? Then you go back and you say, well, key performance drivers that are letting us down. Is it a problem with productivity? Is it a problem with innovation, with customers, etc.? Then you would ask the question, why are we having the problem with the performance drivers? Which of our capabilities is wrong? So is it our leadership? Is it our talent? And then you would say, which of the processes is not giving us the capability that we're looking for? And that is the value profiler, an incredibly practical tool. I'll show you how to use it. The key takeaway, one of the key takeaways here, is that you can only make changes here at the level of the process. And what I mean by that is you can't say, well, tomorrow afternoon, I'm going to change our revenue by 30%, because you can't. You can't change your innovation tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock. You can't improve employee experience tomorrow at 3 p.m., but you can change your recruitment process tomorrow or your learning. So your entry point into anything you do is via your people processes, which give you the capabilities, which give you the performance drivers, which give you the business outcomes. You can measure this in your own organization, and we'll have a look at that. I will show you quickly first that typically we say that these are the processes that are looked after by HR or human resources. And we would say that it is finance's job to ensure that measurement is happening across the piece. What we often find with HR functions is that measurement tends to happen only at these two levels. In other words, the level of processes and the level of workforce capabilities. And in fact, I think Dave and John would probably agree with me, and John is going to give us a case study to illustrate this a little bit later on. When we get a call, it's normally somebody telling us we've got a problem with retention, which might be in this category here of employee experience, or we've got a problem with employee engagement. We very seldom are given problems from the business outcome or the key performance drivers. But of course, your C-suite or your exco, this is what they're interested in. They're less interested in this stuff. These tend to be the area for HR. So the message from here is always try and express your people problems in terms of what is the financial impact and the business impact they're having, not just the workforce impact on the capabilities. And how do you go about measuring this? Well, there are many ways you can do it. One of the ways that we like to do, here's an example from some work we did with Friends Provident, for example, is you just for each process, you can get people to give, I like the survey approach. And you get people to answer questions. So you could say, you know, our learning process is clearly defined. We allocate resources to learning activities based on clearly defined priorities, and get a lot of people to answer those. Sometimes people say, why don't you measure it objectively? In other words, isn't there an objective way to measure recruitment and L&D, etc.? And the answer is no, because what is right in one organization is not going to be right in another. The best source for finding out whether it's working is to ask the people who are subject to the process itself. Now, what do you do with this data? So you're collecting data in effect for every single one of these blocks here. So there are questionnaires, questions for each of those, and they change over time, because what I ask today about recruitment is going to be different to what I ask tomorrow about recruitment, because there are going to be new platforms, new ways of doing recruitment. What we do with the outcome of this is quite interesting. We plot the scores of each of the blocks. So at the top here, we might say, look, we want to understand what impact is our people processes having on our, let's say, our revenue. So here we would say from very little impact on revenue on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, this process has got an enormous impact on revenue. And then from top to bottom, we say how well is this process implemented, or how badly is it implemented. So process, if you like, efficiency or effectiveness runs from very badly implemented in our organization to very high. And these are the answers that you get via the survey from your people. And of course, what you're looking for, if you think about it for a sec, is you're looking for the processes that are really important, but are really badly implemented. Does that make sense? No point in looking at processes that are important and that are well implemented, because changing them is not going to give you any benefit. So they must be important and badly implemented. So if you look at this example here, which by the way comes from Rent-A-Kill Initial from a couple of years ago, which Dave has written up a great case study in his book, Introduction to People Analytics. You can see that recruitment is really important to generating revenue at Rent-A-Kill. but it wasn't really well implemented. So the first project that we implemented there was to fix their recruitment. Then we went on to onboarding and so on as you work your way through. So that is a very simple tool, a very powerful tool showing you how to link finance and people activities. And I will hand over to who's picking up now.
That's to me, Max.
You, Dave.
Stop sharing and that'll be perfect. I think one of the critical things that I'd just like to reinforce is that sounds like it looks quite complicated. In actual fact, this is my little plastic acetate, which Max very kindly gave me about 18 months ago. I carry it around with me wherever I go because it enables me to ensure that I'm constantly thinking, what is the business problem we're trying to solve? What's the implications for the people processes? And I think it immediately starts to make this commercial link between our processes, our practices, and the business areas that the executives are really interested in. So I'm a big advocate of it, and I'm supposedly a people analytics expert and whatever influencer, but I think it's a very simple tool that reminds you about why we are in our roles, and that is to solve business problems. So I just want to very briefly talk a little bit. Well, so how do we change behavior? This is a lovely quote from a good friend of ours, Paul Taffender, from Taffender Consulting. And he said this: it seems to me that most finance heads and HR directors need couples counseling. After all, they come from different worlds. If they could learn to speak each other's language, the passion would ignite. And I think that's what, in essence, what Max and I are trying to say. This is an opportunity to promote and ensure that we are very business focused. What we do need to remember is that there are some challenges here. Activity, being busy, does not mean results. And we've therefore also got to get away from this data silo. I think it's very interesting. We've got operational and people data, which is historically and operationally separate. And what Value Profiler is trying to do is it's trying to get us to think about the people practices and the data that we can then get, but it's also trying to engage with the business and look at, as Max described, level 1 and level 2, and understand what sort of business data is available that can help us to make sense of what's going on. HR's focus is traditionally on metrics that look backwards, and I'm a big advocate of you must not stop doing that, because that's in essence looking at the health check for our function. But it really doesn't look at the future. It doesn't try to make sense of what is going on and replicate it in terms of what does that mean for 2021? What does that mean for this function? What does that mean as we go forward? We've got to try and look beyond employees as costs and determine how profitability, growth, etc. can be improved. And finance has got access to the data that will help us in that respect. Again, within the context of my book, we've identified a 4-step journey within people analytics, and you don't have to follow every one of those steps. But the 4th element is where you're pulling all of this together, you're looking at and using data to the future, and you are starting to become what I call HR as a profit center. And you may poo-poo that and say that's absolute rubbish, but in essence, it can be done in terms of selling services to other organizations. Go and look at Experian, that's what they do. But also is that we can start to demonstrate value by what we do within the HR function. And that's what we've really struggled to replicate over many years. Both finance and HR are working towards achieving a much higher level of performance and profitability, but they're doing it separately. And what we're suggesting is that collaboration can maximize and pull together that effort to make it more beneficial. As I said earlier, activity is not always about what we're after. We need a results-based culture. And we believe is that by drawing these things together, we're able to pull the best of what HR has got and the best of what finance has got. I think when we're looking at changing behavior, that's a complicated and we could spend hours and hours talking about it. Here, I guess, are just some of my headlines, I guess. I think there are 4 things. There's commitment. I think whatever we do, we've got to involve senior management at every stage. The use of analytics and data is a change program for a lot of organizations. we've got to demonstrate an understanding of outcome metrics. That's really important. In other words, the commerciality of what we're trying to achieve. And I do believe that both HR and finance, we're problem solvers. We're not just cost drivers. And I think we've got to try and move into that consulting mode, because as I said earlier, the accountability of data will drive a much clearer business focus. And I think your executives and leaders will appreciate it. There is a need to support, however. This requires education. We're not trying to take decisions away from leaders and managers by saying the evidence says that's now the decision. What we're trying to do is to provide a wider range of data, insights, and recommendations that can ensure that they make a better informed decision. That means that we've got to keep people in the loop. We've got to regularly share what is happening and how we're doing it. And we've also got to try and make sure that we're getting involvement from leaders and managers. They tend to be our clients, but we need to make sure that they are really a very true partner as we take forward the phrase of business partnership. I think involvement means that we've got to find opportunities to involve them. And that could be either in research, in advisory capacity, in task forces, maybe in, if you were running some particular focus groups or whatever. We need to involve leaders and managers to ensure that they're understanding what this is about. Because we've got to reinforce that this is about a diagnosis of what the problem is. But that then is not just about saying, here's the problem and we've solved it. It's then about how do leaders and managers reinforce it with coaching, with role modeling, and maybe in appropriate times rewarding, because it's about feedback. And we know that feedback is a really powerful part of any relationship that you may have. I thought I'd just finish my little slot with a case study. And again, I'm going to talk in the terms of the value profiler. This was a piece of work I did about 5-6 years ago, and you'll see why the relevance of it is. The business problem was that revenue growth, it was flat. Margins in a retail business, which this was constantly under pressure. The CEO was talking to us and saying, the real problem I've got is that there's an inconsistent customer experience. This was a retail business that was late night convenience stores, shops, and wine. And what they'd identified, there was a lack of strong local relationships. And part of that was because store managers, 30% of them were leaving over the past 2 years. They'd seen the pay of them was a real issue. Employee performance was therefore impacted by it because there was no continuity. The leaders were never the same, and they weren't getting any consistent, transparent messages. We then decided to say, well, what do you think the problem is? And the CEO was saying, well, I think it's about leadership. It's about performance. And we said, okay, well, that's fine. I understand that. But actually, we think that there's a root cause of this. And what we did is we spent a bit of time reviewing the recruitment process, which they had. It was costing them £500,000 a year for one of the worst recruitment processes I've probably seen. It was 4 or 5 very informal, nice to know you type of chats. And basically, if you had experience in retail, then you had a pretty good chance of getting the job. As it transpired, what they were doing is that they were taking everybody else's problem people. We said, look, there's a much better way of doing this through evidence. But we said the process will cost $600,000 to implement. It was all around getting data right from the very start of the process through to the very end. We then decided that finance and HR needed to try and help each other to drive this forward. Finance had all the store data, the cash flow projections and everything. And so we started to say, well, look, of the store managers that are left, and obviously there weren't that many of them that were left, which of them are the really good ones? Which of them are the really bad ones? Let's find out, is there any difference in the sort of performance? And we found that there was a 400% difference in sales and 190% difference in profitability between your high performing and your low stroke okay performing. So it was a sort of what we would call an outlier study. This was then taken as a hypothesis to finance. And we said, you've got all these amazing cash flow projections for the next 5 years that they update every month. What if we were able to change the performance of some of these stores by recruiting high performing store managers, because we'd identify what they look like. And they said, well, look, if we did that and we did it across a cross section of branches, not all of them, we predict that we could probably get just over £500,000 in a 3-year period. So 100,000 year one, 250,000 in year two, 275 in year three. So the CEO said, well, that seems like a very different way of projecting a business case to me. HR's never talked to me like this before. We need to do this and we need to do it now. We had a lot of support from sales, from operations, from finance. And so the process was changed, training was done. And as we then look back over the 3 years, we then found that year one, we just failed. It only improved by 95,000. Year two, we exceeded the expectation. Year three, we just about exceeded it. But the bottom line is that through a change of process, by looking at what the business problem was and interrogating what was happening and understanding what impact it was having on people, processes, the business improved its income, its bottom line income by £500,000. The store manager recruitment issue, the retention, the attrition fell to 6.9%, much more, quite low for a retail business. So everything was going great. And I think that's a great story to talk about in terms of taking you from a business problem through to a way in which HR has generated a different level of income through changing their behavior and changing their practices by working with finance. There is a little but. Max always smiles when I say, oh, there's a but. And this is not to advocate that this is a bad story. It's a sad story for me, because the sales guy who was a brilliant advocate of this, a real big stakeholder, he moved on to a larger organization, and his replacement was basically from the I know a good person when I see one. And in essence, what happened is that all that great evidence-based work started to unfold. It was inconsistent in its application. And the bottom line is that 15 months later, the business went into liquidation. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that there is power in the data that you have. You need to make sure that you access it. You need to make sure that you use it to the very best that you can. Now, over to John, who will finish us with a splash perspective.
A splash perspective, wonderful. I am hoping you can see the slides now. I'm just waiting for them to pop up on the main screen so we can all see them here. So what I would talk about here is a global engineering and manufacturing organization. It's based in Scandinavia. They have a total of 25,000 employees, and we got engaged with a business unit where they have about 7,000 employees. Now, when we discussed the value profile, I think Max, he mentioned it, that he was mentioning that where we usually typically get involved is within the actual part where we talk about the workforce capability. And certainly we did that with this organization. She was describing some of the key challenges that she had was from their internal hiring program. They currently had 34%, but they knew they could do much, much better. And in fact, many of their managers were screaming for the internal hiring to be more efficient because of the lack of synergies that you guys know this. When you hire people, if they know the organization, they can move on easily to another role because they know the processes, they know the culture, and they fit very well into the organization. And managers were saying that, look, we need to hire internally, but the process was not structured accordingly. And I'll get into that a little bit later. But they also know that some of the top talent were actually leaving because they didn't have an appropriate career and growth path in front of them. So they didn't feel loved in that sense. They didn't feel that they had a future within the organization. And then they were actually leaving the organization. And this is the top talent. These are the top revenue generating people, if you want to look at it from that perspective. And then the organization, so the CHRO said to me then, look, we have been working a bit on these issues. We know they're there, but we can't really quantify it. So we think we've been speaking to some of the key business units, and then we have a good idea about how much it's actually costing us. We think it's about 4.8 million euros that it's costing us. And some of the reasons for that is simply because, you know, the product efficiency is not there because people are not skilled and trained up in actually delivering according to what they are supposed to do in terms of a very effective productivity method. And also the product innovation is not there because people don't have the right skills or experience to come up with new ideas, new innovation, and drive that forward. And then lastly but not least, the sales were declining as well, which again was a huge thing because, you know, no organization wants sales to decline for real, right? And they also had an idea that because of many of the sales managers were even hired from outside, didn't have the skills and the knowledge that they could apply with their product knowledge and skills of the organization and how they go about doing their business. They couldn't apply that. So that's where they found that the sales were declining. And then obviously, you know, then we have finance involved, as Max and Dave has mentioned before. They could see this in their numbers. Now, I think, you know, if finance teams get involved, then I think it's one of those things where, well, how do we start the collaboration between finance? We know what the problems and challenges are. We can see the output in some of the key performance drivers are not quite there. So what are the next step that we need to do? And what is it that we can do and how can we communicate on this? And again, this is where we come in with the solution that we have. Now, as you can see here on the bottom part of the screen here, when it pops up in a few seconds here, you will see very similar to the value profile. We just flipped it around a little bit. But we can look at the revenue, profit, and innovation. That's where you can see on the left-hand side, that's where finance have and the C-level knows and have focused on these business outcomes all the time. Now, for us to get insight into the more financial parts, we needed to have access to the data that you can see by the financials. We needed to have the sales figures and then also some of the operations figures. And we took all that data into Splash HR, which is a cloud platform where we have a data warehouse where we store all this data, and we take the data out from the applications that exist currently. Now, we then also took a view of, well, now we have the data from the finance side and all the performance metrics, but now, what about on the right-hand side? Now, the right-hand side, this is where we have data that comes from HR. So we can look at the application tracking, the onboarding, compensation, and performance management, and really utilize that to get a better understanding of what are some of the key metrics that we have there. And then looking at getting insight into the data and then combining the data from onboarding, from the talent management, from learning management, we could then start getting some trends and getting some insight into where the problems may be. And as you can see in the very right-hand side, this is where we look at the processes that we can then resolve, like where we got all the data in place and started looking at the processes themselves. And when we looked at the processes, we also identified clearly that they had major issues in the succession planning. And the analysis really found that they had a lack of holistic view of all their employees to identify what roles they had, what skills they had, what capabilities they had, which were needed for the actual roles that they found that were leaving, but also that they needed to put them in the right place at the right time. So they found these huge improvements by also working closer with the recruitment teams, because they needed to have somebody heading that up from recruitment so they can work both from the talent management team, but also from the recruitment team to work very closely on coming up and devising plans to fill those roles internally. And they had to do that actively. And that was another outcome for the process when we talk about the processes. Now, another thing we found actually was the learning and development solution was not utilized enough when it came to developing these people in for promotions. So they didn't have that support from the organization, which was another part of it. Now, after gaining this insight, we partnered them, and these are some of the outcomes that came out from the engagements themselves. And as you can see here, quite significant outcomes. You know, the sales increased by 16%. The internal hiring increased by 62, up to 62% from those 34%, a huge impact. And then the external recruitment cost went down and reduced by 35%. And the surprising fact that came out of it as well, but you could say it's surprising, but it's probably an outcome that most people in HR would know would be an outcome, is the engagement went up big time by 18%. Now, those were not the only outcomes. There were obviously product efficiencies and product innovation metrics that came out at the same time. But I think this kind of shows you a typical engagement that Splash HR has when we go in and then we look at these key challenges that HR has. But we have also seen in other ways that we look at the business outcomes as a potential issue and then drill down to the level 3. But we go typically from level 3 to level 2 to level 1, with level 4 as an outcome as well. And then the key output that comes after that. So I hope this was useful to you to see, you know, Splash HR in practice and how we add value to the table. And of course, we're very proud of this organization. I'm very happy to be helping them and supporting them moving forward in the partnership. So thanks for that. Now, I think maybe we can go to some final observations before we start opening up for questions that I would ask you to start asking. But Dave, is that for you to do the last little bit? You are on mute now.
Happy to. Max will chip in, I'm sure, anyway.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. I think the thing I would say is that, as you can see there, people have talked for a long time about the golden triangle. In other words, that broadening the relationship from just the CFO and the CEO, which has always had a really critical relationship aspect, but bringing the CHRO or the HRD into this golden triangle. And I think that's a real opportunity, which I think this sort of collaboration would take. I think if we look at some final observations, we've probably got 4 of them, I think. I think the first one is that HR and finance, they have opportunities exist to collaborate, to share data and expertise. We've just got to find them. And you know, for an example, workforce planning is an opportunity to build together, you know, a challenge between resource planning, cost, and obviously the potential that people need to move and develop into particular activities. You might be able to just click for me, John. That would be great. Perfect. I think the thing is that we have a chance to identify missed people-related financial opportunities. My perspective here is that HR and finance should be thinking about optimizing the organization, not just optimizing the processes that they are responsible for. And I think that's where forecasting, modeling, outlier studies, that's where we're able to start to use some of the data and really start to ramp it up into a more predictive mode. I think the third thing I would say is, think about the human capital value profiler. It's a key process, which is, you know, simple in concept, to try and determine key business and financial problems and challenges and the impact it has on people processes. And I think it enables us to prioritize where are the performance challenges, where can we add value best, and as we look to 2021, where is HR going to invest its money to get the best return? And I think that's a critical part. And I think my final point is, you don't have to buy or build data-based expertise. Why don't you just borrow it? Finance have got that expertise, and that's a great way of them trying to share their expertise and help the HR team to learn. So those are just a few thoughts that we've got. I think we're opening up for questions now. So please do ask us questions. Otherwise, there will be just a very uncomfortable 5-minute break where silence will be golden. So we've got any questions for us?
I'm looking for questions. Please feel free to ask any questions that you have with regards to this. Otherwise, I might ask a few to you guys, Guy. No, I don't think I can't see any questions there. I don't know if my chat is working, but so one of the questions that I have is, so we have the value profile, and this is to you guys. So when you typically go into organizations, can you mention some best practices of using the value profiler in terms of the consultancy approach that you have when you're using it?
Sure, I'll start, and Max will then add his, as Max is the inventor of it, and I would only bow to his expertise on it. How I use it, I use it as a way of shaping questioning as to, well, what is the business problem and why is it an issue? We always get symptoms. Clients always talk to you about symptoms. And I think that for me, this is how it has always helped me to identify what is the root cause of the issue that we're trying to address. And also why, what HR can then provide in terms of solutions to address those types of problems. So for me, that's where I see it's the critical thing. HR needs to get better at asking dumb questions. Questions about commercials, questions about margins, questions about, profitability and the impact of an issue on their perceived business plan and cash flow. And I think those, for me, are the sorts of things that it immediately sticks in my mind to be able to do. Max, how about you when you've used it?
I think typically people, as I said earlier, come in and ask about workforce related issues, about retention, attrition, stress, etc. And I know from experience that you won't get buy-in from the C-suite, and there won't be budget for an HR project unless you can somehow link it to a business problem. So most of the time I spend pushing to say, so what? When people say, well, we've got really high attrition. And I say, well, that's great news. Does that mean you're losing all of your weak performers? That's great. And they say, no, we're losing our top performers. I say, well, how do you know? And then we start getting into the numbers, and then you start saying, well, what is that costing you in terms of productivity, in terms of innovation, quality, etc. And then we start quantifying it. And I say, right, so what is the cost of the loss of productivity in pound or dollar terms? And then at the end of that, we end up with a really strong business case. And at that point, we can make a decision whether to actually roll out something like the value profiler, not necessarily a value profiler, but whether to go to a wider part of the workforce to ask the questions. So the first part of any business project, to my mind, is always find out what is the business issue from the CXO perspective, not from the HR perspective.
Okay.
So it looks like they are not able to hear us any longer, and
the connection has dropped completely, I can see.
Yeah. It looks like it's externals that are not seeing it.
Technology is a wonderful thing.
Was it something I said? Tell Tom in the chat.
Okay, so yeah, it's just not working, I guess.
No, it's just dropped completely.
Yeah.
Where's can't you tell Tom in the chat? Ask him, because he could talk there. He sent you a message earlier, Dave.
Yeah.
No, it has dropped.
So you can't talk to Tom either.
We can through our.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, but Tom's saying the connection's all fine here.
Oh, it is streaming, he says. I'll see. Sorry.
Yeah, but it's not. I've got it live and it's not.
No, I've got it live.
Yeah. So John, if you want to type, because I can't seem to find the type box here.
The chat.
Yeah, no, the chat, it just disappears. So they've just said they found it very useful. Will we be sharing the slides. So I think we need to say absolutely they will be sharing those slides so that they're accessible.